And that poem is obviously about the psychological damage that he saw when he was in Craig Lockhart, recovering from shell shock. And I've talked about World War I on this podcast before, and I've talked about the shell shock. And if you go to YouTube and you Google World War I shell shock and you watch some of the videos, you can see the horror of the shell shock, which reflects the horror of the war itself. The trenches, the wounds, the gas, the death, the madness of the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths over and over and over again. And that poem, Mental Cases, it reflects the nightmare of the shell shock inside the nightmare of this war. And I wanted to hear a little bit about what shell shock looked like from the outside. And I found an article called Shell Shock Revisited, an examination of the case records of the National Hospital in London by Stephanie Linden and Edgar Jones. And they had some good excerpts coming directly from doctors, nurses that worked in these wards. And here's one. This is a case from the case of a 27-year-old rifleman known as Frank D., who is diagnosed with functional tremor and neurosis like dog chorea. And if you don't know what that is, it's a disease that gives dogs seizures and tremors and fits. And if you, again, go to YouTube, you can see these dogs suffering like that. And this is what the doctors wrote about Frank D. Patient is a territorial, which is a reservist who served heavily in World War I. Patient is a territorial and went out to France in January. He has been quite well up to a week ago, when on April 26th he was buried under a bomb explosion in the trench. He was not unconscious, but dazed and all in a tremble. All his limbs were shaking. He was conscious, being carried by his comrades out of the trenches to a dugout. A few hours afterwards, he had to cry, and he was crying for 2 days. At the same time, his arms began to twitch very frequently at first. He was transferred to the 12th General Hospital, and from there to here. Another case, another entry about a 23-year-old Scottish private known as Henry M. from the 18th Hussars, who was diagnosed with functional facial spasm. On May 13th, and this is 1915, patient was struck by several pieces of shrapnel on the right hand, forearm, shoulder, and on the right side of the nose at its base. He was very dazed, but did not lose consciousness. The wounds healed in a month. About a week after being wounded, he was operated on and ordered that a piece of shrapnel might be removed from his face. On recovering from the anesthesia, he found himself unable to move the right side of his face or open his mouth. This condition, which is quite painless, has persisted since, and he has not eaten solid food or been able to take out his false teeth. He has been fed through a rubber tube inserted between his teeth. In all other respects, he feels well. Patient sits up in bed, gasping in a highly alarming manner, with his left face in a strong tonic spasm and his jaws tightly set. All efforts to open his mouth are unavailing, so strong is the contraction of his masseters. He declares himself unable to breathe unless sitting up, and when made to lie down, his neck is strongly retracted and set, and he breathes violently through his clenched teeth and holds his breath for as long as he can, assuming a purple tinge, which is apt to be disconcerting until one is accustomed to it. By the moral aid given by strong Faradism, which is an electric current applied by the physician, and force applied to the jaw, it was possible to remove a filthy set of false teeth. During this performance, he uttered piercing shrieks and foamed, and his rigidly held arms shook violently. Tears ran from his eyes, and he sweated profusely from his muscular exertion in resisting the attentions, well-intended though they were, of the physician. When asked to close his eyes, he was able to do. In fact, the left eye is half closed in spasm. All tests reveal good power in both sides of the face. The facial and jaw spasm would seem to be voluntary and due to frank malingering. In the intervals of this grotesque performance, he lies back on the pillow without any dyspnea, but he induces an apparent difficulty in breathing at will. Examinations reveal no organic or injury in either nervous or other systems. So just to recap, they're stating that the facial and jaw spasms would seem to be from voluntary and from malingering, basically saying that he's doing this so that he can avoid the war. Here's another different type of symptom of shell shock. This is a 23-year-old private named Albert R., and it's reported that he had marked twitching of the face and the whole body at times trembles. He looks ill and regurgitates wind. He complains of a peculiar feeling of worms growing in the lower part of the abdomen. He coughs considerably and said that his stomach swells up. A lump appears in his throat which chokes him, and he is continually expectorating. The nights are particularly hard on him. He sits up in bed and has great difficulty breathing, cannot lie down properly, but lies over to one side, either left or right, puts his hand up to hold his head still from shaking. He has a depressed and sullen look. There are involuntary movements characterized by a very fine tremor, manifested when his hands are spread out and his fingers are separated. There is a slight tremor in his legs of the same nature as appears in the other part of the body.